I'm Jon-Paul deLange. I'm a husband, I'm a dad, and I'm an opa to a beautiful granddaughter. I'm also an Army combat veteran with 30 years of active duty service and more than 2 dozen deployments around the world. I've had the awesome responsibility and privilege of leading some of our country's finest young men and women into harm's way in service to our nation and bringing them home safely again. In my lifetime, I've seen some breathtaking beauty in this world, and I've met some wonderful people. I've also seen what humans who live in darkness are capable of doing to each other. We're seeing that all around us in today's world. I'm blessed with an amazing life today, an extraordinary life I once thought was out of reach for me. I know now that no matter who you are or what you've done up to this point in your life, achieving your greatness and living an authentic, extraordinary life isn't just your birthright, it's within your reach. And that's why I'm building this channel today. To understand why I'm sharing my story with you and why I wanted to share my story with you, imagine living most of your life carrying unseen wounds inside of you, completely unaware of their existence or that they affect your life in some profound ways. That became my reality in 2018 when I learned that for 57 years of my life, I was living with wounds I couldn't see. Wounds that caused chaos in my home life as a boy. Wounds that affected my performance at school and later in my career. Wounds that influenced my choices of who I surrounded myself with professionally and personally in the personal relationships I chose to get into. And they affected my mental and physical health, how I saw myself, and how it informed a narrative that became my identity. And it was a self-defeating narrative that became my identity. In 2018, I'd been retired from the Army for 11 years. That means in 30 years of service, the military medical system that I belonged to never caught that wound. Yet it was there all along. It was hiding in plain sight. And knowing what I know now, I believe my story isn't unique, sadly. All of us have lived, and many of us continue to live, a version of it. And so, to really understand its origins and what I mean, let me take you back to the generation that came before me, because that's where my story really begins. Because my parents were children during World War II. My dad was a boy in the Netherlands and just 8 years old when the Nazis came into his town. He was 12 when they left, and in between, he lost his dad, saw his mother suffer from chronic pain and depression and drug addiction, and learned of relatives that were executed for hiding Jews. He was 12 when Canadian, British, Polish, Dutch, and American troops liberated Holland. On the other side of the world, my mother was a girl in the Dutch East Indies, which is now Indonesia. And she too was just 8 when the Japanese Imperial Army invaded. They took everything from her, including her father, and sent her, her brothers, and her mother to a concentration camp. She had to fight grown women for enough food just to feed herself. She fought off disease. She did her best to care for her mother and siblings and endured unspeakable abuse in a concentration camp. And she too was 12 when General MacArthur's army liberated her camp, and only to learn that her father died as a POW just weeks before the end of the war. Her family was repatriated to Holland after the war, a place she'd never been to, where she was subjected to constant discrimination at the hands of her countrymen and women. So to say that my parents and hundreds of millions of others from that era suffered overwhelming trauma during the war is an understatement. What most people don't know is that the generation that came before me and the ones that came before them never understood trauma or got treatment for their traumatic experiences. And while trauma has been part of the human condition for thousands of years, medical science had no treatment for it back then. It wasn't until 1980 that PTSD became a thing, an official diagnosis. My parents lived with the unhealed wounds of trauma most of their lives. They had no choice. And back then, trauma was still so misunderstood that medical experts believed only soldiers who engaged in combat could experience it. We've learned so much since 1980, and we now know that's completely untrue. But it's a stereotype that keeps living in today's society. I was born to wounded parents who, to the best of their ability, tried to raise my little brother and me as well as they could, all while dealing with their own wounds from the past that they didn't know were there. Throughout my childhood and into my teenage years, I was completely unaware of the symptoms of trauma they'd passed on to me. Those wounds would stay with me and direct my life for 57 years until something happened that changed my life forever. As a boy, I couldn't know what my parents were struggling with. They were my heroes. They were my rock. And there were good times, but there was a lot of dysfunction and chaos and yelling and screaming in our home. That was the norm. Sometimes the hostility spilled over onto my younger brother and me. Trying to fit in often competed with fighting for survival. There were beatings and beltings. There was also verbal and emotional abuse. And early on, I decided something had to be fundamentally wrong with me to be treated that way. Because why would my parents threaten to abandon me? Why would they ever treat me this way? In some way, I believed as a boy, I formed the belief as a boy that I was fundamentally bad for them to behave that way toward me. So I became an adult at 8 years old when my parents divorced, and I was left to help care for my mother and for my 4-year-old brother. I decided the world was a scary place and that chaos, conflict, and uncertainty were normal. Life was unstable, and I remember feeling so alone and so trapped and asking so many questions about who the hell am I and what the heck am I doing here? No matter how hard I looked, though, they were questions I couldn't find answers to. And by the time I was a teenager, I had moved 12 times. I became a young adult with anxiety, depression, and an immense sense of shame and unworthiness, which of course came with all the coping mechanisms of avoidance, isolation, chronic people-pleasing, constant comparison to others, and perfectionism too. Joining the army probably saved my life, but it didn't save me from the wound that was already there, waiting for its time. Early in my military career, I became obsessed with success, performance, and achievement because the Army rewarded me for it. I felt like achievement was the way to feel seen and heard and matter, and the way to heal from the dysfunction of my family. And also because performing well gave me these temporary highs of thinking maybe, just maybe, I am good enough. And then I got married, and I was totally unequipped for it. I had panic attacks when I realized I had no idea how to do that. And my wife at the time was also unprepared for me or the wounds I was carrying that neither of us could see. For 12 years, we struggled in and out of counseling, and therapy, and none of them spotted what was under the surface either, slowly ruining our life. I deployed as often as I could to escape the runaway train I didn't know how to stop. While my career provided some structure and certainty, I felt like my soul was starving. I was so overwhelmed by the rest of my life and the self sabotaging roller coaster of emotions, overthinking thoughts, and living with a dysregulated and unpredictable nervous system. I just didn't feel confident in myself or my ability to handle my life. So my marriage ended, and I hit rock bottom after a promising relationship I'd gotten into also ended very unexpectedly. In 2018, 11 years after I took my uniform off for the last time, it all started to come into focus for the very first time in my life. From about 2003 until the Iraq War ended in 2011, IEDs were the number one cause of casualties during the war there in Iraq and also in Afghanistan. I'd spent over 12 years of my career crisscrossing the globe, looking for solutions that would protect our troops in combat from these roadside bombs. I understood their destructive power and saw firsthand many times how they could practically slice an up-armored Humvee in two. There's something about the sight of American blood that stays with you, and it stayed with me. I worked myself to exhaustion, survived on 2 to 4 hours of sleep per night for years, and sacrificed my personal life for the mission of saving the lives of soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines that could have been my son or my daughter. And when I saw the story of a U.S. Marine named Ray, whose Humvee was blown up by an IED while he and three of his comrades were on patrol, an incident that killed all three of his buddies, my nervous system had nothing left to give. It was at the end of all the stress I'd put on it since I was a kid and for 30 years in uniform. And even though the guilt I felt didn't make sense, it was so overwhelming that I had a meltdown. It was as if all of my memories of what I'd seen and experienced in that war, and the ethnic cleansing I saw in Kosovo, and the human suffering I'd seen in other parts of the world came to a head. And so I cried uncontrollably for days. I knew then that something more inside of me was going on than I was able to understand. So my wife and I started looking for answers. And that led me to a somatic experiencing practitioner who also happened to be married to a U.S. Marine. For years, I'd heard about PTSD, but it turns out that I knew less than I thought I thought I did about it. Because the military doesn't train service members about PTSD, so no one knows what to look for. And if you were living with trauma then, you just stayed quiet so no one would think you're the weak link. Imagine that at the height of the war in Iraq, kids were going on back-to-back deployments. They were exposed to combat conditions for 6 to 12 months straight. They come home for 30, 60, 90 days, and they were out the door again and again and again. There was barely any time to recover, and they were asked to go into harm's way again and again. And how do you break that news to your family? I just got home, but I'm leaving again. For many, it tore them apart. Most never got any training on reconnecting with their families or reintegrating back into civilian life. So is it any wonder the divorce rate among members of the military is the highest of any profession? Why is it any surprise that 20 or more veterans take their lives every day in this country still? It's because we lack awareness and the right strategies and investments and policies in mental health to mend our service members and their families whose nervous systems are overwhelmed by trauma. I believed only Vietnam era soldiers got it, and it couldn't happen now because we were so well trained and equipped in the days that I was in uniform. That's how ignorant I was about it, and why I never considered that it could happen to me. But when my practitioner gave my wife and I the news, and I learned that I had PTSD big time, 12 symptoms, it felt surreal. But it was the best news I probably ever received because it explained a lot of things about why my life was the way it was and why I was asking the questions I'd been asking for years. And suddenly, the answers to the questions I'd asked since I was a boy and later as a soldier came, and they all started to make sense for the first time. It told me I wasn't defective. I didn't have personality flaws as I thought I did for so many years. And most of all, I wasn't a failure. I was enough. I had PTSD. And with this new awareness, something inside of me broke wide open mentally, emotionally, and spiritually, and awakened me to the profound realization that although all I had been active in, all the protective strategies I was using to try to prove myself and feel in control of my life, no amount of money or success or perfectionism or pleasing others, no amount of anything outside of me was actually filling me up and healing those wounds. Despite all my efforts to the contrary, I realized I wasn't in control, probably for the first time in my life. The subconscious programs of my childhood wounds and my protection strategies they were in charge. And I had been conditioned into giving away all of my power and settling for this life that was spiraling out of control. This was a very humbling moment to feel in every cell of my body that it all comes down to a choice. For 57 years, I carried wounds inside of me from more than 24 deployments and a childhood full of abuse, neglect, and dysfunction. It cost me one marriage and a relationship with my daughter. And so I wondered, how many more are living with the wounds they can't see? How many are needlessly suffering and paying the price along with their families because they have wounds that they can heal, but they don't know it? How many people are suffering today at the hands of parents who are simply wounded and don't know it? I believe it's an epidemic in our country today. So many mass shootings don't just happen because guns are plenty available. They happen because the people who do them are hurting, and no one seems to care or see them or hear them in their moment of need, let alone understand. And that's not an excuse for the people who do these things. It's a symptom of a bigger problem in our society that we must start paying attention to. And so if I was choosing to live like this over and over again, that also meant that I could choose to reclaim my power and choose a different path in my life. So that's what I did. I stopped distracting myself. I started investing in understanding who the hell I was. I got into somatic experiencing with my wife to heal my traumas. We went together 1 to 2 times a week for 5 years, and it changed the trajectory of our life together. I started spending time and energy and resources dismantling limiting subconscious beliefs that I had thought made up my identity and addressed the protective strategies that were really keeping me stuck on this hamster wheel of self-destruction. I really got honest with myself about how I was giving my power away to other people to validate me, to the unfulfilling job that was affecting my marriage, and to my own emotions and thoughts, which I often felt victim to. I learned that asking for help isn't a sign of weakness. It's what successful people do. So I made peace with my past. I started taking risks. I learned to trust myself, and my relationship with my wife, Marcella, and my family began to blossom. And I found my purpose. In January of this year, I quit the government role that was easy money for me, but wasn't right for me anymore. And I went after my soul's purpose to help veterans and their families living with trauma find the freedom, reconnection, and fulfillment that are waiting for them. I genuinely wish for everyone to experience this kind of liberation that I experienced in 2018. This is my life's purpose. There's a courageous, confident, and fulfilled version of yourself waiting for you to discover. You don't have to settle and let life happen to you because it happens for you. You have the power to create it. All that's required is a decision to be the captain of your ship, the author of your life, a decision to go within, make peace with the past, reconnect with yourself, and develop the habits and skills you need to create the extraordinary life you deserve. It's not just possible, it's your destiny. The question is, when will you trade your fear for your greatness and embrace a more authentic life? And that's why I'm here, to provide a roadmap to becoming more, to build a safe, inclusive, and compassionate community for veterans and their families to feel seen and heard, to find the resources they need to grow and reconnect and create the kind of life they deserve. You can get started by subscribing to this channel, where I'll go live each week to have some fun with you, to teach you on a ton of topics designed to help you navigate out of the darkness and into the light. Sometimes it'll be a hot mess, but we're here to support each other, and that's when magical things happen. And if you'd like to go deeper, I'm here to listen to you, support you, and guide you to making the next right decision of integrity for yourself at this moment in your life, whatever that is for you. No judgment, just listening and accepting you for who you are, seeing you, hearing you. Book a call with me anytime on my website, Jon-Paul deLange.com. Thank you guys for being here. Thank you for receiving this message. I'm sending you all so much love and support, and I can't wait to see you real soon. Aloha.